2 decades, the impact of sleep on health and wellness has come into more focus thanks to developments in science, enabling more studies and research into sleep science. To understand the extent of the potential foundational role that sleep plays in one's health and wellness, we performed a detailed literature review, and I'll be sharing some of the findings from this review with you. Using these findings, we have started considering the potential use of sleep as part of an insurer's risk management strategy, and Elevate Life have completed an exploratory study on their policyholders, and Matan will share some of their insights with you today. In summary, recent developments in sleep science have highlighted that sleep may not only be one of the 3 pillars of health, but the foundation on which the other 2 pillars, exercise and healthy eating, are built. Research has shown that sleeping patterns ultimately impact all causes of mortality and have linkages to dread diseases. Unfortunately, factors such as stress, environmental issues, and substance abuse, as well as poor daytime habits, caregiving duties, and excessive exposure to blue light late at night all impact both the quantity and quality of sleep that individuals are getting. According to a 2020 study from Munich Re Life, more than 15% of people fall in a sleep duration outside the recommended 6 to 8 hours, and this proportion is growing. The CDC reports that 21% of adults in the US are getting less than 6 hours, and a third of adults are not finding their sleep duration sufficient. But why does this reduction in sleep duration and quality matter? To put the importance of sleep into context, let's consider the need for sleep against the need for food, water, and air. There are no controlled scientific studies on how long people can survive without food or water, as it would be unethical. But most research in the area involves case studies of people in emergency survival situations. And we all tend to know the general rules of thumb. Individuals can survive 1 to 3 weeks without food, 2 to 4 days without water, and 3 minutes without air. For sleep, the amount of time people can survive without it is unfortunately not that clear, but extreme symptoms appear after only 36 hours without sleep. These include speech impairment and hallucinations. When it comes to the longest recorded deprivation of sleep, food, and water, most people would be surprised to learn that the record for sleep is shorter than the record for both water and food. The longest that individuals have been known to survive without food are 2 separate recorded instances, one of 382 days, but it's important to note that this individual was mortally obese at the start and had access to water, sugar, tea, coffee, soda, and vitamins. The second was 74 days. The longest without water was 18 days, but it's thought that he might have had access to condensation on the walls of his prison cell during this period. The longest without air, 11 minutes and 35 seconds. However, divers are known to survive up to 22 minutes without air if they are exposed to pure oxygen before then being deprived of oxygen. The longest recorded time without sleep is approximately 264 hours, or just over 11 consecutive days. Over the last 20 years, based on a rich new scientific understanding of sleep, we no longer have to ask what sleep is good for. Instead, we are now forced to consider whether there are any biological functions that do not benefit by a good night's sleep. Today, we'll discuss the impact of sleep deprivation on a few of these functions and ultimately consider what this implies for all-cause mortality. So let's start with hormones and the endocrine system. Sleep has numerous impacts on the endocrine system and our hormones. Several nights of just 4 hours of sleep in otherwise healthy individuals impairs blood sugar regulation to such an extent that they would be classified as pre-diabetic. The impact of sleep on glucose metabolism may promote the development of obesity, diabetes, and other endocrine hormonal conditions, further reducing quality of life and negatively impacting longevity. But the impact of sleep deprivation on weight maintenance and obesity is not only limited to the impact on blood sugar regulation. The impact of sleep on weight maintenance or obesity can be seen as a cycle, and it helps to illustrate how it is sometimes difficult to distinguish where sleep is the cause of an observed condition or the effect of another. Being sleep deprived creates metabolic changes that contributes to obesity and insulin resistance. Combining this with tiredness from short sleep will lead to lower energy levels and less motivation for physical activities. Specifically, a reduction on non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which includes unconscious actions such as fidgeting. In addition to reduced motivation for physical activities, studies have also found that reduction in sleep significantly increases the ghrelin levels in the gut and reduces our leptin levels. Both hormones play an important role in our hunger and satiety cues. This results in an increase in hunger and craving for higher energy foods, as well as leaving us not as satiated as we would under normal conditions. Today, such higher calorie food cravings can lead to increases in highly processed food intake due to our easy access to takeout and comfort food. Studies have shown that there is a positive dose-response relationship between the consumption of fast food and the risk of depression, as well as the ability to deal with stressful situations in a positive manner. Therefore, high processed food intake has been linked to increased feelings of stress. And as I mentioned at the start, increased levels of stress have been highlighted as one of the potential causes of sleep reduction, closing the loop on a potentially negative short sleep cycle and highlighting the difficulties when trying to identify the underlying causes of weight maintenance issues. Short sleep also impacts risks from hypertension, strokes, and cardiovascular diseases. In a 2011 study, coronary heart disease and strokes were strongly associated with either short or long sleep durations for either developing or dying from the condition. Studies have suggested that 9 hours or more sleep may represent a useful diagnostic tool for detecting unidentified, undiagnosed morbidities, and sleeping 5 hours or less can be regarded as a higher risk group for cardiovascular mortality and morbidity. Lastly, we'll consider the impact of sleep deprivation on mental health. Studies have found that different forms of mental illness were much more commonly diagnosed out of cohorts of sleep extremes, with clinical depression and suicide being higher with individuals outside of the recommended sleep ranges. Sleeping durations can be an indication of underlying psychological illness and a need for care. The effect of Alzheimer's disease and sleep is still a relatively controversial subject, but studies are being done in the measurement of REM sleep and electronic brainwaves, leading to the prediction of Alzheimer's disease years in advance. So given this impact of sleep on morbidity, what is the ultimate result on our mortality? So in the graphs, we plotted the relative mortality impact of sleep taken from 12 different studies. Looking at the overall impact of sleep on mortality, this tends to be a U-shaped or sometimes a J-shaped curve, with 7 to 8 hours of sleep considered a healthy habit, indicating that both short and long sleep can provide important information with regards to increased mortality risk. When considering the impact of sleeping patterns on mortality, it's important to appreciate that sleep has a short-term impact as well as longer-term consequences. In short durations, the lack of sleep increases the risk of accidents, both vehicular and workplace related. Studies have shown that going too long without sleep can impair your ability to drive the same way as drinking too much alcohol. Being awake for at least 18 consecutive hours would have the same cognitive impairment as an average male consuming 2 beers within an hour. So in the South African context, if you've been awake for at least 18 hours, in terms of cognitive ability, you would be considered over the legal blood alcohol content for driving. Unfortunately, unlike having a few too many beers, with sleep deprivation, having a shot of espresso and waiting it out will only aggravate the situation, as being awake for at least 24 hours results in cognitive impairment equivalent to an average male of having 4 beers in a 1-hour period. Therefore, it's not surprisingly that a 2014 study found that sleeping only 6 hours per night increases your risk of having a car crash by 33% compared to sleeping 7 or 8 hours a night. Sleeping less than 7 hours a night increases your risk of death from all causes of mortality by up to 24%. And what is also very important to bear in mind is that studies have found that you cannot pay back the sleep debt accumulated over time. That means although moving to a baseline of 7 to 8 hours of sleep duration per night will definitely have health benefits going forward, the long-term effects are still present from long periods spent in sleep extremes. Another important factor is that on both sides of 7 hours of sleep, either increasing sleep per day or decreasing it will increase mortality and risk of all illnesses. In the elderly population of 60 and older, long sleep was associated with an increase in all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality. As previously mentioned, 9 hours or more sleep may represent a useful diagnostic tool for detecting unidentified, undiagnosed morbidities. Several studies have shown that the lack of sleep and irregular sleep is associated with specific outcomes that are undesirable in societies, specifically associated with poorer health outcomes. An incorrect amount of sleep has been linked to a number of diseases, and specifically 7 of the 15 leading causes of death in the United States. This includes cardiovascular disease, malignant neoplasms, accidents, diabetes, septicemia, and hypertension. The link between sleep and both morbidity and mortality indicates that sleeping patterns can be used as either a tool for assessing individual risk or for managing risk, as a person's sleeping patterns may indicate potential future poorer health outcomes or the presence of unidentified underlying illnesses. Sleep has, however, been neglected as a potential driver and lever for longevity. Tiredness and daytime sleepiness are increasing each decade, making it a considerable amount of potential policyholders that are experiencing the negative effects of their sleeping patterns. As insurers, through the underwriting process, we may be able to help holistically identify individuals and provide mechanisms to improve their overall quality of sleep, quality of life, and improved health outcomes. I'll now hand over to Matan to share the findings from their review into wearables and their exploratory study with you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. So now that we know the incredible impact that sleep has on our lives and our longevity, our day-to-day health, what can we do about this? So as a life insurer, and I run a life insurer, it is important for us to assess risk and understand how that impacts people's morbidity and longevity. And having this meaningful piece to augment the overall picture can be a fundamental shift to understanding and predicting the assessment and management of this risk over time. So what we embarked on was a journey to start unpacking how we could use this data in a commercially viable way in order to improve the underwriting and risk assessment that is currently done in the life insurance space. Our goals of our exploration were actually fourfold. So the first was to understand how sleep data can be used to identify undiagnosed conditions. Because naturally, the only things that we can use when looking at and assessing someone's well-being is what they've been diagnosed for, what they've actually gone to the doctor for, and what they disclose. If they haven't gone to the doctor and engaged, then we can't pick up that information from a risk perspective. Sleep data could be a mechanism for us to expand this picture and use more data points to understand and predict and diagnose these conditions. Secondly, providing an early warning system and signs to understand, well, someone may not have an issue right now, but could they have something soon into the future? And giving an early warning detection mechanism for those undiagnosed conditions or future conditions that may be diagnosed and impact their morbidity and longevity. Then if someone has diagnosed diagnosed conditions, there is a question of, well, how severe are those conditions? Now, medicine, sorry, let me go back a second. So if someone does have diagnosed conditions, then there's the question around, well, how severe are those conditions? So the question is, well, medicine only tells us a certain part of the picture. Sleep data and those patterns can increase that understanding and give us a sense of how severe these diagnosed conditions really are. And then finally, is it a mechanism for us to extend the underwriting to not just at a point in time, but a more broader picture of how someone's health looks like over a period, and actually having a more meaningful engagement with an individual, trying to intervene in their well-being, so that even if they're unwell to begin with, you can go on a journey with them and actually improve their well-being over time, or manage it and take control of that risk and assessment, and truly manage risk as opposed to just assess it. So when we embarked on this journey, we started off with appreciating that the research that we were embarking on was exploratory in nature, that research of this type in the life insurance space specifically hasn't been done before. So what we needed to do was to create a research question that was open-ended enough so that we could have space to see where the exploration goes, and let the data that and analysis that we were doing open up and allow us to go down avenues if the data was telling us that. So what the research question in question was focused on was identifying techniques whereby sleep tracking data, and we'll chat about that in a little bit, specifically sleep tracking data can be used in the life insurance context to generate observable outcomes for the specific purpose of risk classification and management. And by giving us this open-ended question and allowing us to explore in this way, we can set the foundation for future analyses that we can embark on in order to build the models and train the models that we're going to use to replace these more traditional underwriting techniques. Before we embarked on the exploratory analysis, we needed to bed down a few key ideas and set the scene a little bit based on a lot of the research that Nicole and her team embarked on as the preparatory point of this work. The first was to appreciate, okay, now that we have understood the landscape and the effect that sleep has on someone's well-being, what is the true definition and the quantifiable definition of good sleep and bad sleep? And it really comes down to three quantitative metrics of good sleep, which are the duration of sleep, the continuity of sleep, and the timing of sleep. So from a duration perspective, getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep as an adult. Continuity is not waking up more than one time in the night, so getting continuous night sleep. And then timing is very much understanding, okay, well, how can someone maintain a good circadian rhythm, which is fundamental. So the periods that they are in the different sleep states and zones and phases is right to make sure that they're fully rested and healthy. And the proxy for that is going to bed and waking up at regular times. With these quantitative metrics, there are also qualitative metrics that go along with it. You can do all the quantitative things right, but also still feel tired and irritable. So if you're feeling like you have mood swings and you're still tired and you need to take naps in the day, it could be an indication that even if you're getting enough sleep and you're feeling like you're not waking up in the night, you're going to bed regularly at a regular time, you're still feeling all of these things, it could be an indication that you have poor quality sleep. But that was outside the scope of our analysis, as we weren't surveying individuals. We were using data at our disposal, so sleep data at our disposal, in order to understand these trends and appreciate, okay, what can the sleep data do to enhance our risk management picture. The second important message and important analysis that we needed to understand before we embarked on actually seeing how sleep data can be used is appreciating that is there a commercially viable source of data that is accurate enough in order to use for the purposes of our analysis. The current evidence-based best practice assessment of sleep is something called polysomnography. And what that is looking at someone and assessing someone in a clinical setting using visual and audio monitoring in order to measure things like their brain waves and their vitals, seeing their movement through the night in order to assess their quality of sleep. And this can take anything from take any period from a few hours all the way to a few days to properly understand someone's sleep habits using this particular approach. Now, naturally, PSG is very accurate, but it's not commercially viable in the insurance space. you can do all of the right things. You can promote someone to get this assessment done, but will you actually get policy sold is a whole other question. If you have to tell them that need to go away for a few days, do a sleep study, and then come back, and then you can underwrite their policy properly, that's really not feasible. So we needed an alternative, and that's why we turned to sleep tracker data, which has started to become more and more prevalent in the wearable devices and the phones and apps that we use every day. So when looking at this new data source with regards to sleep, the question was, well, is it as a good a quality to that of PSG? If it's not as accurate or not close to as accurate, then we actually are going to embark on an analysis where, the inputs into the analysis are just, very poor, and what's the point? So we started off with a deep analysis on understanding what does tracker data look like relative to PSG, and can we trust it? And fortunately, for this analysis, the answer was yes. The quality of sleep tracker data is at a very high quality. Just using the accelerometer and the heart rate monitor within a tracking device, the results of PSG versus sleep data is highly correlated, even though there are certain metrics where tracker data overestimates duration and the time in sleep phases. The quantum of the data and how they correlate with one another is very strongly aligned. And then when looking at the next question, okay, well, now we can use sleep tracker data. What do we want from the device that we're using to track this data and to generate this data? Well, we want firstly that data is consistent. So when we're looking at one device versus the same device, that is not giving a completely different picture, and we can actually, assume that, data from the same device tells us the same picture. Looking at the evidence around this and the research of other studies that have looked into this question, the answer is very much yes, that two devices put on the same person for the same period of time show the same picture. And that consistency is fundamental. And then finally, well, now we have this consistency of data, but which device should we actually use? There are so many devices out there, apart from the smartphones that we currently, that all have in our pocket. But they're the Fitbits of the world, and Garmin and Sunto, and such a wide range of these devices that all purport to do these amazing things. Which one is actually, showing out best? And we did a very robust study into this as well, and we appreciated that there were certain situations where different devices came up trumps. But the one that was most consistently in the picture was Fitbit. And that's important for us to appreciate when, we're looking at our own data and the data that we've collected for the analysis, which I'll chat about in a few moments. Then moving on to the question of, well, okay, now we've got an alternative to PSG. Will people actually collect this data? And actually engage with it in such a way that this data will be generated for us to use. If we were going to replace these traditional mechanisms of underwriting individuals, and we looked at the surveys and sample studies from similar environments as South Africa. So, first world, middle to upper middle income environments, which, is the majority of the insurance or fully underwritten insurance market in South Africa. And what was that telling us with regards to the user base of sleep trackers and sleep apps? And what it showed us was that by and large, it actually is something that is very used in the environment and the industry today. About 1 in 5 individuals, even back in 2018, were using a tracking device. And this actually increased to about a third of people in the higher LSM groups. When looking at the individuals that were already tracking their sleep data, either through a tracker or through an app, already 16% of people in 2017 in America were using trackers or apps to monitor their sleep. So something that people already engaged in. And in the same study, when asking people would they use it if they aren't currently, that number increased to 45%. So this is a commercially viable consumer-rich space where people are going to engage and use these devices and generate the data that can then be used for these downstream purposes like underwriting their risk if it is available. So with the scene set and understanding that, okay, now there is this data source, there's an alternative to PSG, and this data can be used in this new meaningful way to understand risk with all of the benefits that Nicole has explained come with it. Well, how has Elevate gone about doing this? And what have we found, and what is the analysis that we actually did, and what are the results currently showing? So the ability for Elevate to achieve this was in very large part due to the fact that our product has an underpin, which is our Elevate Me portal. And what we use this portal for is for our rewards program, where we ask people to opt in and share their data from multiple wellness sources. And in return, we give them a set of educational goals on how to improve every month, and they can get rewarded with cashbacks on their premium for doing the right things. A simple relationship and shared incentives where if you're healthier and more well, we'll give you money back because you're a more, or rather a better insurance risk. And what we've achieved by doing this is actually created a collection mechanism for us to collect this wellness data and then do the analysis of how this data can then be used in different areas of the insurance journey in order to improve, the experience of customers. And one such way is the fact that because we collect wearable data for this purpose, we can use the sleep data that comes from that in order to do analyses like the ones that we are talking about on sleep today. So the data collection mechanism was to collect the data from the Elevate Me portal. It's important to note that this was fully on an opt-in basis, fully compliant to POPIA legislation, so no data is collected without the individual's consent. The data was fully anonymized, and what we did is that we selected the period between 1 April 2021 to the 31st of March 2022. We looked specifically at individuals that had synced Fitbit data because we know that that's the best source of data currently. We looked at sleep data that was tracked for a period of 60 days before or after the underwriting that they had done for their policies. And we combined this wearable data with the underwriting information that we had from them becoming policyholders, and added it and generated a profile of the data of, well, now that we have this broader picture of sleep data, what does this sleep data show to their overall profile of their risk status and assessing their risk based on this profile. If you want more information on the data collection process and methodology, this research has been published in the South African Actuarial magazine, and you can go to the link on the screen to read up more. But going swiftly to the results and unpacking what we found is that here we'll unpack two such policyholders and what the sleep data showed regarding their risk assessment situation, or their risk situation rather. Now, firstly, the first policyholder that we looked at was one that, on the face of it, had very problematic sleep behavior. They were sleeping too little. The variation of how much sleep they were getting was very large. They were going to sleep at very random times, and their wake-ups were far more than one a night on many nights over the period looked at. And this was on top of the fact that in the initial underwriting, we noted and they disclosed that they had acute depression. Now, for someone with acute depression, the situation of having very poor sleep habits is only compounded, and that issue and that fact that Nicole mentioned with the cause and effect that comes from sleep is one that becomes very prevalent, because now we don't know whether the poor sleep is exacerbating the depression or whether the depression is causing the poor sleep. But either way, for someone just on the face of it to have such poor sleep habits and having poor mental health is very problematic. And when we looked to the trend data that followed this, of breaking down those three metrics of sleep that we talked about, those quantifiable metrics that we want to look at, duration, continuity, and timing, over an extended period of 3 months from the data of underwriting, we saw that it very much reinforced the averages that we noted when looking at the profile on a higher level. But one thing that was very interesting, that when we looked at the period of 3 months after that, so from the beginning of 2022 all the way to the end of our study, at 31st of March 2022, we noted that at the end of January, the picture very much changed. And this was something that was a very meaningful change that actually sparked our interest to understand why. And when exploring their broader data that came from the Elevate Me portal, which also speaks to the fact that looking at sleep data holistically beyond just the data itself and the underwriting data, but amongst the other wellness data, we noticed that actually if we looked at we looked at the health dimension specifically, that in the period of 2021 where their sleep was very sporadic, we noticed that their mental health condition was very poorly managed. But going into the period where the whole picture changed, we saw that their sleep improved markedly. And this speaks to the fact that the treatment of the mental health condition had a fundamental impact on showing that the sleep improved as an effect, and that the treatment that they were on was actually working. So going back to those goals that we talked about at the start, that it was able to identify an undiagnosed condition, it was also able to show that the treatment of the condition was then working once the new treatment regimen was followed. Looking at policyholder number 2 as another example, this individual on the face of it shows that actually their sleep situation is very good. They're an actuary. The only disclosed medical issue was back pain, but the sleep the variation around the sleep metrics was very tight. They were getting enough sleep. They weren't waking up too much. They were going to sleep at a reasonable time and regularly at that time over the period of the analysis looked at. The one thing that was very interesting when we looked at the period from when they were underwritten onwards was, while things looked very good in the trends at the start, it started to devolve quite significantly as we moved towards the end of the study, showing that the averages that we were looking at on a higher level were hiding the more nuanced impacts when we looked at the trends and the actual day-to-day data. And what we noticed, again, when looking at the broader data that surrounded this individual, was that they had shared their credit data information with us as well. And what we noted was actually that their credit situation was very good when the underwriting was done. But as they went on in their journey and they moved into 2022, their credit situation became very poor. They started to miss payments, ask for more credit from their bank. They had more inquiries to get more debt from other providers, and their credit score started to drop to a relatively risky level, which indicates again that this cause and effect aspect of sleep, where while their credit situation was fine, they were sleeping just fine. But when it started to devolve, their sleep followed. And it actually shows that the sleep data gave the ability as an early warning mechanism to identify, okay, there's a problem occurring here. Let's reach out to this individual, understand what their situation is, offer a helping hand, manage that risk effectively, and avoid them getting into a hole that they couldn't get out of. So just to summarize the analysis that we've done and where we're at and where we're going, there is a lot of further exploration that is required. We need to unpack more policyholders, understand the context of more individuals, to identify those triggers that are fundamental to the modeling that will then become the protocols and the models that we then train on to replace the traditional underwriting mechanisms that are so prevalently used in the market, but that can definitely be improved upon by adding sleep data. And then, the way that actuaries work is that we're all about making sure that we monitor and we enhance and we improve over time. And that is fundamental to this process as well, to see how the experience evolves with using this new approach, monitoring and enhancing this mechanism, and then building that back into the protocols to make them that much better. Fundamentally, this actually shows the power of using broader sources of data within the underwriting journey and actually showing that there's a meaningful impact to doing so and can be done at large scale to the betterment of the insurance industry and the techniques that we use. Thank you very much.